Hello, everybody. Welcome to our Pokemon climate change video. My name is Lucas. Hope you guys are having a great day wherever you are watching this. I'm one of the podcasters for the Sprites of Life podcast, and today, to add to our video collection on Pokemon, we are going to be using Pokemon to talk about the major issues happening with our Earth's changing climate. So hopefully you guys stick around and get a chance to learn about climate change. I find most climate change education to either be boring or a bit too doom and gloomy. So let's go ahead and use Pokemon to try and talk about some of these effects. Now, the other videos we've done, we've talked about a broad strokes and how Pokemon could teach more about conservation. And we've also gone a bit into the nitty-gritty on invasive species and how they can cause quite a bit of a disaster as well. For today's video, we are going to be focusing on climate change. So if we'll start off with climate change for beginners, what's the difference between climate change and global warming, the different effects of climate change, that sort of thing. We'll also talk about how Pokemon has made connections already throughout the games. We'll talk about some of the Pokemon that have been directly impacted by a changing environment. We'll then go to the fun part of coming up with new Pokedex entries for Pokemon affected by climate change. And then finally, we'll wrap up to talk about some of the doom and gloom talk from climate change and how much of it we should be following. So let's just get right into it. Let's go ahead and talk about global warming. You've all heard this one. This is the one they used when I was a kid. It was the word they constantly spewed. And it defines the rise in global temperatures due to mainly the increased concentrations of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere. You've all seen a diagram like this at some point where the sun's radiation goes to the Earth absorbs it, some of it stays in the atmosphere, the rest leaves. And then when you have more greenhouse gases like CO2 and methane, more of the heat stays, heating up the planet. You've all seen this diagram. You all know what it means. But whenever we got those colder winters, people were like, okay, what gives? I thought the planet was supposed to get warmer. And so more scientists did research and we came up with a better name for it, climate change. I'll be honest, this was 100% on the scientists when they're coming with naming things. When we tried to use popular words like this, occasionally it can backfire if we didn't have all of the research right away. We didn't realize just how far the extent would go, and that's why we renamed it climate change. So climate change is defined as the increased changes in the measures of the climate over a long period of time, including precipitation, temperatures, and wind patterns. In this case, different effects, like global warming, are part of climate change. You'll also get ocean sea level rise, which is a part of climate change. Ocean acidification, climate change. Climate change is now the whole, versus global warming is just a part of that whole. So that's the difference between the two, and that's why you'll hear us talk more about climate change instead of global warming these days. So whenever you hear someone using global warming, it's a dated term, and it doesn't encompass the entire problem. Now, if you're talking about climate change, you cannot avoid people talking about the natural cycles of climate change. So there are several things that can actually affect the climate pretty effectively. Changing in solar radiation, volcanoes, and the cycles that occur with the Earth's change in its orbit and how it tilts. The issue is that these things take quite a bit of time. You're all familiar with the Ice Age. You've all taught about it. You've all learned about it. But with the Ice Age, it took a long time in order for temperatures to get low enough to have that. And it stayed there for a while. What we have seen throughout studying the temperatures globally is that we have had a massive increase right around the time we started pumping a whole bunch of CO2 and other gases into the atmosphere. We can study this through the ice core samples. We can look through ice cores and find the different temperatures and amount of CO2 that have been in the ecosystem. We know that the temperature has risen. We know that it's impacted by people. The debate is no longer, is climate change real? The debate is now, how badly is it going to affect everybody? Anybody who tells you that climate change isn't real is dating themselves by about 10 to 15 years, probably more. We have known climate change is a thing for 100 years. It is just only now that we are finally opening talkings about it and trying to do something. Now, there are tons of things that climate change can do, but here are some of the major ones you're all probably familiar with. Let's start with the easy ones. Increased temperature and sea level rise. So when the global warming affects, it causes the ice to melt, increasing the ocean levels rises, reduces our amount of fresh water, and then causes these massive flooding events, even on days where there's no major storms. Those are the streets of Miami, just during some daytime flooding. This happens on occasion when the tides get really high. It happens in cities like Charleston, South Carolina as well. This is causing a pretty big issue because if you look at a global map, most major cities are on the water. So either those cities are going to have to spend billions, if not trillions of dollars to make their cities waterproof, or they're going to have to run away. You're going to have to abandon parts of the cities, if not the whole city, if the flooding gets too bad. Now, you're all probably familiar with drought. We've seen this drought happening all across the planet, but here's some parts in the western United States where we are losing more and more fresh water. This has to do with the evaporation rate. Warmer air and warmer temperatures are going to cause the evaporation rate to increase, so more water is taken up by the air. Now, that also has another effect. The stronger storms and more flooding inland also can be affected because that evaporation rate is not the only thing that changes. The increased heat increases the amount of water vapor that a cloud can hold, causing massive, what we call 500 or 1,000 year storms to occur much more frequently than 500 or 1,000 years. And this isn't including hurricanes being more powerful from warming oceans. These are inland. This is Nebraska. You're looking at a picture of Nebraska in 2019. They had nothing to do with a hurricane, but those increased storms inland are becoming a major issue to worry about. Now, the big one that people are like, what's going on with everything here? Why is it cold this winter? I thought we were supposed to get warmer. That has to do in part with the polar vortex. That warm air that we've been generating starts to move further north, and warm air rises, cold air falls. That warm air is destabilizing the polar vortex, that massive jet stream of cold air, and then it causes it to sink. It causes it to bend. This is where you get those massive freezes in areas that aren't used to them. This is where you get Texas's entire power system shutting down because it was not built to deal with it. This is a huge issue during the winter months for people who are homeless or people who just aren't built for it. There are people up north in snow places who laugh when they see like 2 inches of snow shutting down a city in a southern location. But it is a real problem for cities that just don't know how to deal with it. It's an issue. The last one, and one of my favorites to talk about, because even if you removed everything else, increased temperature, sea level rise, this would be enough to scare me. Ocean acidification is something that happens when the CO2 in the atmosphere gets absorbed by the water. Now, the ocean is a massive carbon sink. All that carbon we put in the air doesn't just go in the air. A lot of it gets absorbed by the ocean. Now, when it does get absorbed by the ocean, it goes through a chemical process that creates more acid. And that acidity brings down the overall acidity of the seawater. This causes a lot of issues with organisms that need calcium or carbon ions to build their shell. Without it, they are no longer able to sustain that shell. They get a lot smaller or weaker, and they are now unable to survive. Ocean acidification is something that has nothing to do with temperature, but it has everything to do with climate change. It is not something affected overall by like heat or cold. It is something that has damaged these organisms just by the amount of toxins we're putting into our air. Now, if we jump to the Pokemon side of things, you all might recognize this map as my favorite generation, Generation 3, the Hoenn region. Now, if you remember our villains of the story, they had some ideas about what to do with power. So, step one, you get ourselves your T-Magma Grunts. They get themselves a red orb. Now, once they have a red orb, they decide to go ahead and wake up basically Lava Godzilla. Very nice, very dramatic. And then radiates its energy. Groudon heats up the world. And I don't know what their plan was after that, because when the oceans dry up and the sun boils up, they'll be gone too. That extreme heat goes on forever and ever, cooks the planet, everybody dies to the end. Meanwhile, on the Team Aqua side of things, they decided to get themselves a blue orb and summon the Super Rain Death Whale. Majestic. Anyway, that thing releases its energy of blue, causes the rains to fall, the sea levels to rise, and, well, if it just kept going at that rate, the whole region would have flooded and they would have drowned. So we've already talked about how climate can affect a region in Pokemon. The talk wasn't, oh, how is mankind affecting it? It's like, no, how bad could things get if it went one way or the other? From the Team Magma side, even if their plan had worked and only some of the ocean had dried up instead of alling it, all that land would have been, like, worthless because it had been bathed in salt for, like, millions upon millions of years. We've actually had somebody who tried to come up with a dam for the Mediterranean in Europe, and this was one of the biggest flaws with his plan. All that land is worthless, and you're also changing the weather patterns. You're going to make it a lot harder for ecosystems to thrive in the center of land masses, because now you just changed the whole weather pattern. So great job. Team Aqua, on the other hand, they would have just flooded the world. They would have just flooded everything. And so while the ocean would have been a lot larger, a lot of ocean creatures depend on living near coastlines in order to survive. If you get rid of the coastlines, most ocean creatures die as well. Both plans were stupid. Both plans changed the climate. And that's kind of as far as Pokemon went until they made their way to the Galar region. Now, in the Galar region, you all might remember our friend Corsola as well as Cursula. All the Pokemon people, all the streamers and the YouTubers were talking about this. And I loved how much attention it was getting because it brought attention to bleaching. Coral bleaching is what happens when the coral gets so sick that the algae living on it decides to leave. The algae is what helps feed and maintain the coral, and it also gives it its color. That bleaching event can occur from extreme ocean temperatures, pollution, and ocean acidification. So it was a really cool nod to how damaging an ecosystem can be, especially over time. And we've noticed these bleaching events that have occurred quite a bit, especially recent years where the South Florida waters really did get closer to, if not around 100 degrees. This was during the summer of 2023, so right around when I'm recording this. Now, the other Pokemon they talk about for the different environmental changes is our Galarian Weezing. Now, if you look back into the history of Galar, the lore, the place used to be a polluted dump, kind of referencing the Industrial Revolution of the UK. What happened, though, is that in that timeline, there were a ton of Weezings until this Weezing, the Galarian Weezing, took form, and instead of pumping out toxins and grossness, it started sucking them in and releasing different chemicals, different clean airs. Now, do you see animals changing based on the climate? 100%. This is my favorite example. It's called Allen's Rule, where you can take an organism like a rabbit, and as you move them further north, their species starts to change and their body starts to change. In deserts, you're going to have them have nice long lives, nice big ears in order to radiate out that heat. As you get to colder climates, they get more tucked in. Their ears get a lot smaller. They're trying to conserve their body heat. You can see animals changing in order to fit the climate all the time. Birds are a great example. Birds will use their beaks to help thermoregulate. So if a bird has a nice short beak, it doesn't really need to exude as much heat as some of the others, versus something like a toucan who lives in super tropical environments and uses that beak to help thermoregulate and help keep a lot of the heat away from the body. Incidentally, if you ever wondered why toucan shoots fire from its beak, that's why. The more you know. So we have seen Pokemon change throughout time when it comes to a climate changing or environment changing. And they've done it in a rather quick turnabout way. And we've seen a few other animals do this as well. But y'all are here for Pokemon. So let's go ahead and talk about it. Let's go ahead and see what's down the pipe. What Pokemon would be affected by climate change? All right, so Dreadnought, first down the line, one of my favorite turtle Pokemon, next to Blastoise. Dreadnought is an amazing design, and it is based on a snapping turtle. So if you read the Dex entry, Dreadnought lurks along the shorelines. When prey comes to drink water, Dreadnought stretches its neck out and chomps down on them. This is a pretty good description of a snapping turtle. Not gonna lie, this is exactly what they'll do. But how would a turtle be affected by climate change? And the answer is actually their eggs. So we have a saying amongst biologists, cool chicks, messed it up already. Cool guys, hot chicks. The idea is that with turtles, they are going to have more female eggs if it's a warmer temperature and more male eggs if it's colder. If you're having a warming climate, that means that these organisms are now having more and more females, which means that even if they all survive, the ratio's off and there's going to be less of them. So here was my write-up for the Pokedex entry, something to change it up a bit. Dreadnought lays its eggs on the shoreline and leaves them to survive on their own. If the weather gets too warm, only females will hatch. And this is a great talk for turtle biology, at least I think so. where turtles will leave their eggs to survive on their own. It sticks to that tough demeanor of Dreadnought, but then it also draws attention to how warming climates will affect them and get more female. That would actually be a fun bit if you found them in like a desert lake region and you basically found more females in those areas. I think that'd be a nice touch. There wouldn't be the only turtles affected by climate change. Every single turtle or tortoise uses that same method in order to reproduce. The temperature affects their offspring. They're not the only reptiles to have that happen. So you could kind of write that down for any of them. I just feel like people attribute it more to sea turtles than everything else, but it does affect all the other turtles as well. All right, let's see what else is down the pipe. Alright, so we got Frostlast. I wanted to have a little bit of fun with this one. So the Snowland Pokemon, when it finds humans or Pokemon it likes, it freezes them and takes them to its chilly den where they become decorations. Yikes. Well, I'm a big believer that in Pokemon, it follows the cartoon rule of freezing, as in if you're frozen in a block of ice, you get to just pop out when it gets warm. So what would happen to a Frostlast in an environment where the snow is going away? I mean, it would either have to migrate and take its decorations with it, or would have to abandon them for someplace a little bit colder. And this is a real issue we're seeing. Ski resorts across the world are having to make more and more fake snow because they're just not getting enough for their ski vacation. Now, that doesn't exactly seem like a major, hard-hitting issue for the average person, but it goes to show you just how bad it's getting in a lot of regions. So let's have a little bit of fun with it. Frostlast keeps its victim frozen as decoration. As the weather has warmed in the mountains, people from long ago have thawed out, lost and confused. I think it would be hilarious to have a Legends of Arceus-like cameo from one of the people. What would that one guy who hated us? Someone tell me in the comments who would that one guy who hated us in Legends of Arceus. Anywho, it would be great if he got frozen, and that way he didn't have any ancestors that I had to deal with, and he just pops up because a Frostlast froze him, thought he was handsome, and just put him in a block of ice for hundreds of years. Then he gets thawed out from climate change, and he just pops on out. That does have a funner twist to it than just saying, oh, the Frostlasts are gone. They went away because it got too hot. Now they're all dying off. Climate change is pretty terrifying, but you can still poke a little bit of fun. You could also do this for all the other ice Pokemon. Darmanitan might come down from the mountains and start just making its home in like freezers of restaurants, and people are having to try and get them out. Bergmites keep coming smaller and smaller to that at some point people are trying to have them as like pocket pets. There's a million things you can do with a bunch of ice Pokemon thawing away. All right, let's see what else is down the tube. Alrighty, so we are going to talk about shellfish. We're going to talk about Cloister, one of the OG shellfish. Its shell is extremely hard. It cannot be shattered even with a bomb. The shell opens only when it is attacked. So yeah, the bivalve Pokemon stands up to its name. It's got a super tough, durable shell, but if you remember, we talked about ocean acidification. So how would that affect a Cloister? Well, Cloister's shell is probably made out of calcium, just like a normal oyster. All that acidity is going to start damaging the shell and making it weaker. Now this Pokemon has to make the choice of either adapting or leaving from its environment. This is not a fun way to go where your main form of defense is going away. So let's change things up. When Cloister's waters are polluted, its shell grows brittle over time. Their spikes do less damage, and they have to migrate to colder climates to compensate. We actually see this in horseshoe crabs, where ones in colder climates have tougher shells than those in warmer climates. So all these Cloisters are probably going to make their way further north, causing disturbances to the local ecosystem, and then you're losing a major, well, I'm going to say predator. Look at this thing. This thing is definitely hunting stuff down in these warmer waters. So they can cause a whole range of issues in the Pokemon world. I think it's a really fun way to talk about ocean acidification in a way that most people don't even know what it is. So I'm glad it gives people a chance to hear about it to begin with. But I think using Pokemon like Cloister is a fun way to do it. And they're not the only ones. Things like barnacles and crabs are also affected by ocean acidification in different ways. Crabs actually have their reproductive systems messed with. Barnacles start to deteriorate over time. It's really messed up just how changing just a little bit of the pH, dropping that acidity a little bit lower, is enough to mess up so many different organisms in so many unique and terrible ways. Now, normally I do 3 of these, but I had to do a 4th because there's always someone who benefits from a bad time, and this guy is waiting for climate change. Delmize is an absolute goon. I love this thing. It beats up whale lords because it can and sucks their life energy. I love it. But it does have another dex entry I want to read off. The Sea Creeper Pokemon, the soul of seaweed adrift in the waves becomes reborn as this Pokemon. It maintains itself with new infusions of seabed detritus and seaweed. So it feeds off death at the bottom of the ocean as well as algae and kelp. One of the biggest issues we've run into with climate change are increased algae blooms. Now, climate change has a funny way of compounding on itself. Warmer temperatures are what the algae crave. They love that stuff. It helps them grow more. But also the increased storms cause more runoff from the land, more nutrients, more fertilizer to make their way in. It's the second thing they love, food. So as these runoff events keep happening, as more nutrients leaves the land and into the ocean, the algae feeds and grows. And then it grows, and it grows. And some of these algae are incredibly toxic in large numbers. This is why we have a massive die-off in South America of dozens of whales passing away after ingesting this algae. It poisoned them. Now, this also has the effect of if the algae dies in large numbers, all the bacteria at the bottom, it's going to be like free buffet, best day of our tiny lives. And they're going to consume and break down all of that algae, consuming all the oxygen while they're down there. This is why a lot of organisms die in red tide events. All that buildup of death, they're feeding off of it. They're growing from it. Delmize would love this chance of all this algae there, all this death in the ocean. It is growing and getting stronger and stronger. As seabed builds up with detritus, Delmize becomes stronger. When algae blooms grow out of control, many beach towns are evacuated to escape its vicious attacks. One of the reasons I wrote this is because I can't animate worth a squat, hence why I use these fancy PowerPoints. I think it would be amazing to have this thing evolve and have it just take over an entire ship. I would love, if Dynamaxing and Gigamaxing were still a thing, have the algae go completely out of control and it just takes an entire cruise liner. Like it just engulfs it and just uses it to beat up scores of whale lords. I think that would be an amazing addition, but if I can't do that, I can at least talk about how the algae is going to be affected by the climate change. And we do have plenty of other Pokemon that would enjoy climate change. We have our Kelpie Sea Dragon friend here who is going to absolutely adore living out in all that algae. And we'll also have any of the jellyfish Pokemon. Jellyfish populations grow faster with warmer water. So that's why you're getting a lot more jellyfish. And people are talking about the end of the oceans from all the jellyfish. That one's a bit exaggerated, but we are seeing quite a bit of jellyfish more and more often. So are we doomed? Well, to be honest, it's complicated. There are people who are going to be more affected by climate change. There are going to be children and older adults who are more susceptible to heat, low-income communities, communities of color. These are all groups that tend to be disparaged against normally in society. But we also have major issues with the climate taking it out on them too. These are people who don't have the means to get away or move or start a new life every single year where there's a major storm system. We also have to concede that we are in the middle of a mass extinction. So a lot of organisms are passing away in part to climate change in our actions. And so we have to remember that the Earth has gone through this sort of thing before and has come out of it. The only difference is we might not make it out in one piece. So what are we going to have to do about it? Well, for climate change, we have to be prepared to make some hard choices. We have to start thinking about how best to rebuild our cities, how best to use fewer fossil fuels, how best to try and work with the climate change affecting. Prevention is not happening anymore. We have to start working on trying to save what we can. We also have to be aware that if we don't, we're going to be spending more and more money trying to fix things and then them getting destroyed. It's cheaper in the short term to try and just ignore it, but in the long term, it is going to damage so many countries financially, it could lead to a lot of civil unrest across the world. So are we doomed? I mean, I think that society will crumble if we don't do something. So let's talk about doing something. The first thing you got to do is use good sources. You have to be able to use a good source in order to know what's going on. Don't just read the news article. Read the scientific article attached to it. That's a huge help in making sure you know what's going on. You also want to make sure you hold your leaders accountable. Climate change is real. If they're denying it, they need to either be corrected or removed. Now, from a massive federal level, That's one election everyone tends to pay attention to no matter what country you're in. You have to pay attention at the local level too. You have to see the local mayors and city council members. They're the ones who are going to be making the decisions on your town. They're the ones who are going to approve clean energy options or deny them. They're the ones who are going to be needed to hold accountable. So make sure you're taking more part in those local elections. Now, for the fun part, let's go ahead and just pick a Pokemon. Go ahead and pick any Pokemon. For me, it's Galar. I love this guy, and I want to challenge you all. What would climate change do to your Pokemon? How would it affect it? Now, with Galar, I wanted to give myself a bit of a challenge, and being one of my favorite Pokemon, I had to think, well, what's going on in our world that would affect a giant stone monster man? And the answer is archaeology. We have found that flooding has damaged ancient sites to the point that we can't reach them or research them anymore. What would happen if the people that Galar was protecting had to abandon it because the area got too hot? What would happen if the caves the Galar lived in flooded and they couldn't get out? Climate change could very much damage this Pokemon's whole bit of protecting people if it can't get to the people or if the people have left it behind. And whatever you guys come up with, my last step is always to share the experience. Share what you've learned on your Instagrams, on your TikToks, on your social media. Share the fun bit. Share it in the comments for all I care. I want you guys to take this story outside of your normal zone of friends and just talk about, hey, that's a fun thought experiment. Let's give it a go. And then compare it to what organisms are dealing with today. Climate change is a big topic. It can be really scary to talk about. Try and use Pokemon to teach about it. Trying to use something more fun to engage with makes it a little more interesting, more people attached to it. That's why we do what we do. We want people to learn, we want people to grow, and I feel like Pokemon is a really good medium to do that. I do want to thank you all for coming and listening. I do want to thank you all for being a part of this. Obviously, climate change is not an easy topic, but if you want to hear more about what we have to say about a lot of different topics, from fishing mini games to fighting type Pokemon, go ahead and follow us. We're on Discord. We're on every podcast site. I just put Spotify because it's my personal favorite. We're everywhere you can find us. Thank you so much for being a part of this. If you have any thoughts, go ahead and leave it in the comments. Please have a wonderful rest of your day or night. We'll see you guys next time. Bye, everybody.